Welcome to the Emerging Lawyer series at the Coffee Conversation Show, powered by the Emerging India Forum, TF, and a tech partner, Prime Infotech Solution. Theme is the policy architect inside the mind of Anubha Mukherjee, a powerhouse in India's legal and policy landscape with 2 decades of influence across governance, risk, compliance, mining, environment, pharmaceuticals, technology, and more. Earlier, she was at Vedanta. Now, she is Head of Public Affairs, IBSL at Bayer, from shaping regulatory dialogues at the highest levels to representing India internationally for thalassemia advocacy. Anubha embodies a rare blend of legal intellect, policy foresight, and purpose driven leadership. Today, we dive into a journey across courtrooms, corporate boardrooms, advocacy platforms, and global stages, uncovering the experiences, convictions, and stories that shape one of India's most strategic legal policy leaders. And we also come to know Anubha as a person. So, welcome, Anubha, to today's Coffee Conversation episode.
Thank you so much, Ramir. I'm really excited to be here and really look forward to the conversation. Thanks for inviting me.
So, I'm happy you're doing from you're in transit and doing from your hotel room. So, this is what coffee brings to this conversation, those special memories. So let me
Yeah.
explain you. There'll be 3 rounds:
Okay.
professional, personal, and a surprise where you like coffee with Karan, the rapid fire round, you're in the hot
Wow.
seat. And this is your inspiration, Legal AI 101, which
Mm-hmm.
will be autographed and sent to you. So let's
Love
begin
that.
the first round. Parinam Lion Amir Virani, hosted Coffee Good Legal Tech event at Prime Infotech Solution, author of 20 books. So my first question, Anuba. How has the journey shaped up and what were the key defining moments you had?
So I think what really shaped my journey or what really laid the foundation of being a lawyer is my oratory skills, which were incorporated in me at a very young age by my mother and by my father. So my mother was really a stage blaster, in her college days, and she used to write poetry, elocutions, and she used to participate in debates. So I still remember that, once I was rejected in a dance competition. And then I came home, I cried my heart out, and I told my mother that why was I not selected? And that was the day she gave her diary to me, and she said that today I will give you something that will set you apart. Because when people are dancing, they're dancing in a bunch, but when you go and deliver the speech, you would be the one shining on the stage. So I think that somewhere resonated with me, and there's been no looking back. And I participated in debate competitions and elocutions. And so I would say that it's my love for oratory, love for public speaking, that primarily attracted me to this field of legal policy and regulatory. And then, of course, I developed a lot of interest in the field of politics per se. And when one, used to look at Sanghvis of the world and Narimans of the world, and one would read about all of them. I think those were the normative, you could say, memories and years that really, really inspired me to take up law as a profession. And that's what really shaped my career.
So let's build up the conversation, Anupa. Public affairs is often described as navigating the unseen powers. How do you decode the shifting geopolitical and regulatory landscape on a day-to-day basis?
So, Amir, first of all, I would like to divide that into two parts. When you say unseen powers, I really don't think so. People tend to say that public affairs is all about, what's happening behind the screen. There's a lot of, there's an element of secrecy. There's an element of something clandestine. At least that's not how I have seen public affairs. Maybe because I have always been a part of very ethical and compliant companies, starting with Genesis Burson Marsteller, which is now Burson. And I started my public affairs journey back in 2006 with Burson Marsteller, and they are consulting, and we used to cater to across the board clients. And never did I see any kind of behind the back or those kind of conversations. Same for Vedanta, same for Bayer. So I think it depends on who is really driving the public affairs mandate. Yes, if you mean by unseen powers, um, the fine print in a policy document, yes, because when you look at a policy document, it is conveying something to a lay person, but it's conveying something completely different to a law person. So in that sense, you could probably say that we see, as lawyers, as public affairs people, we see what is not apparent to the to a non-public affairs person. Then we also see where the influence is coming from. So for instance, when you look at a certain ministry, you see only the minister, probably you see people who are popular across media, and you say that, for instance, if I have to go to Ministry of Mines, it is this and this minister for me. But as public affairs people, we know that's not right. We know that it's not only the Ministry of Mines that's making the policy for, let's say, the mining sector. There is a role being played by Niti Aayog. There's a role being played by the Prime Minister's office. There's a role being played by the Ministry of Environment and Forest. So, in that sense, yes, unseen, because you don't want to see. A public affairs person typically wants to see. And I think that's the entire role. How I decode, geopolitics and other, changing, trends on a day-to-day basis is through my connect with business. And this would be my, sort of advice to all the younger public affairs and legal folks also, that uh, I have always thought of law not as a subject, but always as a way to think. I think Justice Krishna Iyer also said that law is not a dead letter. It's not a dead word. It is something that needs to be applied. So unless and until you keep your ears and eyes open, unless and until you know what impacts the business, you won't be able to decode these rapid changes and dynamic policy shifts on a day-to-day basis. Now if I didn't know about the vitality or the significance of critical minerals, for instance, uh, for let's say a Vedanta or a Rio Tinto, I would never be able to understand how today the US is conducting itself in terms of tariffs, how India is responding, what are the FTAs going to look like. Because if I don't know what my business wants, then I'm not going to be able to decipher what's happening in the external space. So I think the mantra, if you like, would be connect with the business, and connect on the ground, and the ability to really go beyond the law. Because sometimes what happens is that as lawyers, and I have also suffered from that, on and off, we tend to go a lot in depth, but when you look horizontally, sometimes we are not so well informed. So I would say that uh, the conscious effort to stay informed about the business, about the moving pieces in the geopolitical scenario, taxation, tariffs, that is what helps me to decode on a day to day basis.
So, Anubhav, when regulations change overnight, bans, counterfeits, pricing shocks, how do you balance business continuity with public policy ethics?
So I think there are no two ways about it, Amir. I mean, there has to be a balance. Uh, I think transparency and keeping a channel of communication always open is how I have always dealt with, these kind of knee-jerk reactions. I'm not going to, call out a typical instance, but I can say that why only bans and counterfeits and stuff like that in the industrial space. Even if you look at, society, right? If you look at social sector as well, sometimes we are asking for all sorts of I won't say freebies, but all sorts of reliefs from the government. So, for instance, if you look at the policy changes in the area of blood safety these days, if you look at the Jharkhand High Court order, where the High Court has said that nucleic acid testing is mandatory, voluntary blood donation is mandatory. So why do we always look at it from the place of being a victim, where government is announcing something, and oh, we are the victims? Sometimes it's very positive as well. So like the Jharkhand High Court order. So then how do you balance? How does then the state balance that, oh, overnight I am told to make voluntary blood donation mandatory? How do I do that? You do that with collaboration with the society. You do that with the help of public private partnership. And you do that with constant dialogue. Keep the channel of communication open, and keep the evidence moving, keep the information going. And I think that's about the only thing you can do, and that helps you balance.
So, Anubhav, you have worked across some of the most heavily regulated sectors: mining, pharma, chemicals, alcohol, tech. Which sector taught you the most unexpected lessons about governance and policy behavior?
Well, mining taught me, I think, a lot of my lessons, especially as a corporate lawyer, as a policy person, as a public affairs person, and also as a human being. I don't think any sector, and I'm very new to the pharma sector, so I don't think I can really talk about it. But mining taught me a lot, because, very frankly, when I went to mining sector, I thought. Just like any other person, I thought of it as a dirty sector. Folks who do not really regard environment, folks who do not regard, forests, communities. But I went to that sector. What I saw was completely different, and my mind was blown over by the kind of community work that was happening. My mind was blown over by the kind of regulatory work that the government was doing. This was in 2019, when National Minerals Policy had just been announced, and my mandate was really to see that translate into the law, into the statute, which is the MMDR Act. And oh my God, what fun it was, because the way we worked with the government, the way we contributed our inputs as an industry, through the FICCIs and CIIs of the world, the way we use law firms to actually look at the statute and then see where all we could, make suggestions. And then the way the government adopted some, dropped some suggestions, and how we came up with a brand new MMDR. So that is one sector where I have actually seen, the regulation evolve in front of my eyes. So there used to be auction regime earlier. Then they made it into something more flexible. From non-auction, they moved to auction. Then they made it into something more flexible, something more customized. Lots of incentives were added. So I would say for sure, mining sector is a sector that has really been very surprising to me in terms of the speed at which the reforms were made and the regulations evolved.
Wow. Thank you for leading to the next question. In your 2 decades of work, what is the biggest mindset shift you have observed in corporate India regarding compliance and regulation?
So I would say two things here. One is sanctions. Because when I was looking after compliance at Vedanta, that was the time when sanctions were just getting spoken about, right? Some people were convinced, some people were not convinced, because look here, why do we bother so much about sanctions that the US of A is imposing? We don't even have any business with US, and all sorts of arguments are there on the table, because drafting a sanctions policy and drafting a sanctions program is humongous task, right? It's expensive. But then once everybody understood that it had to be done, I mean, there was no choice. And now see today where we are standing in terms of what the US is doing. So when I look back, I see sanctions policy that we drafted or had begun to draft as one of the key mindset changes. The other one I would say is DPDP Act. So this whole conversation around data privacy, which was earlier only a conversation, I have seen DPDP Act being discussed in the board meetings, and I used to represent the compliance team before the board, and I saw how the whole narrative changed, right? And same for environment, I would say that how environment became absolutely tops, and there would be absolutely no gap which would be tolerated when it came to environmental clearances and environmental compliance. So I would say actually not two but these three areas where I clearly witnessed change and needle moving so swiftly.
Wow. So, Anubhav, you have been part of board level compliance reporting. What does it really take to drive accountability at the highest corporate levels?
I would say understanding and connection to the ground, because when you are, just talking legal jargons, or you just talking about something which is 30,000 feet, making motherhood statements like, we need to do this because this is the law of the land. I don't think it cuts ice with anybody, not even, I won't say promoters, but anybody, any other professional as well. But the moment you are able to show it to them in simple language, what does it mean for the environment, what does it mean for the people. So when you're talking about compliances like emissions, when you're talking about tanks being fixed and how much money it would take, when you tell them that no, you have to do this because section so and so says you have to do it, I mean, people want to find a way around it, that there must be a saving clause, there must be an exemption. But when you explain it to them that, look, if we don't do this, this is how business is going to be impacted in future. So as a lawyer, as a public affairs person, as a compliance head, you have to be able to show to your promoter what will happen in future, and how much money will we save in future, how will we de-risk our company if we take this cost now. So I think connecting people with knowledge, on the ground information, is what really worked for me, and I'm sure it'll work for anybody who's in that role.
Wow. So, investor litigation support demands precision, Anubhav. How do you convert legal risk into a narrative that financial stakeholders can understand?
So here, there is no one answer. uh, it has to be a case to case approach. In my experience as an investor litigation lawyer, I felt that you cannot tell the company that, okay, these are my 20 investor litigation cases, and let's just make them sit, and let's just settle all the investor litigation cases because they don't look nice, right? Typically the investor litigation cases are for paltry sum. There were actually some cases where our lawyer was spending more time going to that court than the person had actually claimed or wanted to claim. But we did not settle it. You know why? Because it was because of a certain corporate action that those claims had come. Now if we had gone after this one claim and settled it, it would have resulted into some kind of an interpretation in our, of course there is estoppel, and there is, not with without prejudice, and all that is there. But still we didn't want to do this as a company, because how can we question this whole bundle of claims against a certain corporate action? We are defending that corporate action, and then we go and settle one claim which is against that corporate action. So here I would say that discretion, experience, and meticulousness, which a lawyer is supposed to have anyway. A lawyer cannot do without, meticulousness. So take each case on its own basis, and then if you can recommend to the company that, look, if we settle this one, we will be actually de-risking the company, because this one looks small, but it can spiral into something, very big. So I think it is that experience, and it is that ability to see in future, that typically helps you to create that kind of a solution oriented mindset in the minds of your promoters, or the company. And that's how you drive accountability, and that's how you look after something like investor litigation.
Wow. So let's go memory down the lane, Anubha. Having shaped policies for multiple industries, which advocacy win or breakthrough remains closest to your heart and why?
Well, this is something that happened many, many years back, but somehow I tend to always remember it as, my best win. Though I have had much bigger wins in courtrooms, in boardrooms. But here was one, case around bromine flame retardants that happened in 2007 or 8. India was coming up, I think, with its e-waste legislation, and under that e-waste legislation, there was, a restriction on hazardous substances, where my clients' substances were listed as banned. You know, and the clients were producing these bromine flame retardants, which basically increase the time it takes to catch fire. So they are very critical. They are specialty chemicals. So when we approach the government to find out that, hey, where is the threshold limit? You just banned. I mean, just banned. It's a blanket ban. So I was completely flummoxed to find out that the government actually had no particular reason to do that. And they were absolutely open to, receiving any empirical data or any scientific rationale telling them that this is the threshold that you should probably look at, antimony trioxide or something like that. And finally, they agreed to a particular threshold, and they did not ban the substance. So I think sometimes what happens is that, not because government is, doing some witch hunting, because we tend to think that, you know like you also mentioned, overnight bans and counterfeits. And it's not that government is sitting out there to ban you or ban your products or plants and factories. No, because especially today's government, it is so pro business, and they're trying to relax so many statutes and decriminalization and all. But you have to go and tell them that, what is the reason. Because what I have seen is that they would prefer to err, rather than, going against public interest. So when it came about a substance about which they were not sure how it impacts the environment, how it impacts human health, they just, as any welfare state, they just went ahead and banned it. But then later we had to react to it, and then how the law just flipped, that is something that I still hold very dear to my heart.
Wow. So, as someone who works across global leadership teams, how different is India's regulatory temperament from the rest of the world, Anubha?
So this might get me in a spot, but let me say that India, I think, follows a very balanced path, as it does in every other field, right? Whether you talk about India's culture, whether you talk about its, politics, or anything for that matter, I think we are a very balanced population. So when I look at the regulatory developments or reforms, I see that the Indian government is very conscious that while they want to go global, yes, they do want to follow international best practices. Yes, they do want to attract investment. But at the same time, they are conscious of the local peculiarities. They are conscious that we cannot be having an apple to apple kind of a comparison with countries like America or EU. Uh, they know that they have to be probably, they would receive a lot of flack for being regressive. But what I see in Indian regulatory development is that they always uh, try to strike a balance. Sometimes they tend to get over conservative, because like I gave you the example of bromine flame retardants, that if they think that there might be some interest of public, that may get hurt by something which is looking very progressive, and nobody is coming forward to actually tell them that how it would not impact negatively, then they go ahead and take the conservative stand. But I've also seen that when people approach them with proper evidence, they're happy to take a progressive stand. So I would say very conscious regulation making is what I look at India as.
Wow. So, Anubha, your work requires diplomacy, legal acumen, storytelling, and crisis management. How do you integrate these skills into your leadership style?
I would say lived experience, because, like I said, even on the social side, when I work for thalassemia patients advocacy group, that is a lived experience. It's my first-hand experience that informs all my policy recommendations on blood safety, on drugs, essential medicines, disability, and even on the corporate side, it's my lived experience, my proximity to the business. Like I said, that I'm in transit today because I was attending a summit, a business, that business organized, and I was connecting with people. I was trying to understand, what business looks like in 2026, what are the targets. Now, a lawyer or a policy person may think that, what do I have to do with targets or EBITDA or anything else, top line, bottom line? Why? Because I will come into the picture when there is a crisis. I will come into the picture when there's an overnight ban. But if you don't prepare yourself, and if you don't walk the journey with the business or the social cause, then I do not think that you can integrate your experiences, or you can bring any leadership style to bear upon what you're doing. So I would say, in one sentence, it would be lived experience, and it would be proximity to the cause that you are standing up for, that helps me integrate all these facets of my experience.
Wow. Thank you again to leading me to my next question. You founded Thalassemia Patients Advocacy Group. What inspired you to start this group, and how has your experience been, and what changes did you see after you formed this group?
So, like I said, lived experience. I happen to be a patient of thalassemia major myself. I'm a transfusion dependent thalassemic for 45 odd years now. And now you know my age. Uh, so,
Mhm.
that is what really, because I grew up in hospitals, but I did not grow up as a patient. I think I was growing up as a patient advocate. And whenever there was any kind of requirement or any kind of issue, uh, in our ward or in our hospital, I would quickly get up, do a representation. Even as a child, I would do that. And my parents would encourage me to do such things, stand up, speak up, be vocal, don't be shy, don't be underconfident. So I think that's where I started thinking about a certain kind of an organization that I would like to set up. So in 2017, I just consolidated all my work, which I was doing anyway, under the aegis of this umbrella. And we are about five adult thalassemia patients who run this organization. And we have zones. So in zones, we have 35 odd people who carry out the work of TPAG in various zones of the country. So the whole country gets addressed. And the change that I have seen ever since we came into the picture is that thalassemia is no more an alien word. We've done a lot of media advocacy around safe blood, and I would definitely like to take at least some credit of the kind of litigations and policy changes and even the conversations that are happening around safe blood and nucleic acid testing today. So that is our main area of work along with disability, and I think that's my comfort zone where I see everything that I love in this world come together, starting with law.
Beautiful. So, at Coffee, we are getting to know about various disabilities, and people feel this is a safe space. I want to start do a fireside chat between you. There is another one who has got a type 1 diabetes, another coffee speaker who has a special disability, and many, many more. Come here, have how you overcame those disabilities and how you're creating your groups and creating social impact, being a change maker. So let's plan that. So my next question will be, what trends do you see in next 5 years in policy making in India?
So now that's very broad. I think the trend that I see is that it has to be more collaborative, and I am seeing that today. There was a time when it was a reactive policy making, where we used to have a problem and then we would go to the government. Like I explained the bromine case to you, most of the cases were like that. Something getting confiscated, something getting banned, then the public affairs people will go into the picture. But today, a very interesting trend that I saw in the past 7 to 8 years is the linkage between litigation and policy. So I witnessed a couple of cases where the policy changed while the litigation was on, and how it impacted litigation positively and vice versa. So I'm not saying that there is a certain interference that judiciary at some juncture does to ensure that a policy sees the light of the day, because that's not their area, to make policies. But I'm seeing a very positive change where the executive is okay with the judiciary setting up a committee or something, and then everybody works together, even the civil society is invited. So I think collaboration is what I am seeing more and more, and I think that is going to be the trend. uh, Even if you look at other policies, I see how government now reaches out to corporates. Earlier it used to be the other way around. Especially I'm seeing this with Ministry of Health and all the other ministries which are on the social side of the spectrum. And they reach out, they are welcoming, they want patients to come forward, they want companies to come forward. And business is no more such a dirty word, because I remember there was a point, and typically because India is that kind of society, right? uh, Rich people are not always good people, and that is changing. And I see that change, whether it's because of social media, whether it's because of we are evolving as a society. But I see it having a huge bearing on how policies are done in India, by collaboration, by seeing to it that there's greater good of the greater number, public interest is served, but at the same time, we grow as a country, and we want to be a rich country at some point, right? We want to be a Viksit Bharat by 2047. So I think I see everything moving in that direction.
Wow. So my last question for your professional journey, Ram. What advice would you give to young lawyers who aspire to enter into policy affairs but don't know where to begin?
So I would say that, first of all, keep your minds absolutely open. That is something that I almost repent, because when I was in law school, I was very hung up on litigation, because that's what we used to see. For us, being a lawyer meant, they meant litigating. There was nothing else to be done. So I would say that if you have already decided that you would do policy work, then I hope there are good reasons for it. So do whatever you do after exploring, after being a part of an organization that does policy work. There are no shortcuts. I know it's cliched, but it's still true. Today we have AI, we have Copilot, we have everything. Even lawyers are using Harvey and other kind of softwares. But I would say there is no replacement for hard work. If you're coming to policy and public affairs as a lawyer, I would say you have an edge. Any day you have an edge, and that edge will always remain. So try to look at government affairs as just a means, but try to focus more on what can you do as a lawyer on the policy front and all the legal front. What are the kind of changes that you can suggest in a certain law? What are the kind of changes you can suggest in a certain policy? So I think don't look at public affairs as a more comfortable job that you can have while you can still be a lawyer. No, that's not right, because then you will just be an average public affairs person. You will never make it to the top. So what you should do is you should read just as a typical lawyer. Even today I study a lot, and it's not that because I don't litigate so I don't have to study. So please don't come to public affairs thinking that we will go in a MNC and then it will be a very nice life. It is a nice life, but it is a lot of hard work involved. So come to public affairs thinking that you have to work very hard. You have to have the knack of speaking to people. You have to have the knack of stepping out, because public affairs can get very uncomfortable, right? You have to
Mm.
go to various ministries, you have to get your hands dirty, you have to be ready to speak to just about anybody. So just as you do in case of litigation, sometimes we have to do the munshi's job also. We have to write an application with our hands. So even here in public affairs, I think be ready for hard work.
Very beautiful. So let's go next round and understand Anubha as a person. Tell us about your family and your formative years.
So, like I said, I was a child with thalassemia, and my family turned that into an advantage, because they said that, okay, that's okay if you can't do one, two, three, but then you can do four, five, six so well. So they channelized all my anger, all my discomfort, whatever was there towards speaking. So they put a lot of emphasis on studies and oratory, because they said that now you've got this, that's fine, but this is the reason why you have to put an extra effort to prove yourself. So I think that got ingrained in me by my siblings, by my parents, and those were my normative years. Even my teachers, I think the mantra was really not to give me any kind of exemption because of thalassemia. I think that played a very big role in uh, making me the person I am today. So yeah, a very happy childhood. Of course, hospitals were there and drugs and everything was there, but I think my family just made the best of whatever life had given. And then when I got married, my husband, I mean, he has the same outlook that, yeah, why should this stop you? Because then there is diabetes and there's asthma, there's so many other things. So in school, people used to actually tease me that, oh, poor thalassemia is suffering from Anubha. so so that's how it came to, so we all turned it into a joke. So I think that really helped me, and that gave me a very close to normal childhood. But at the same time, it also taught me to recognize my real limitations and make the best use of my advantages.
Wow. So, Anuba, you were a national champion in debating. Do you still debate at home, and who usually wins?
Well, I debate all the time, right? Of course, I debate with my husband. I don't always win, but yes, there are times when he has to tell me that I'm not going to win, so it's okay. You keep your argument, I'll keep my peace. And I debate a lot with my siblings, and I just love to bring home a message and bring home a point. And in office as well, there's a lot of, sometimes there's an argument that a CEO wants to make, or a business person wants to make, and then I have another argument, and there's a very good healthy kind of I don't know, debate, but definitely discussion. And yes, I have kept that, I wouldn't call it hobby, but yes, I have kept that streak very much alive in me. And today's podcast is a testament. I ensure that I go to whatever forums are available, especially if they are about inspiring law students, if it's about inspiring patients suffering from thalassemia. So yeah, I do that till date, and oratory is still, and debating is still very much on.
Wow. So, which is your hobby or creative interest which helps you to unwind after a long day of policy affairs work?
Well, I think it would have to be reading, because this is one hobby that my sister sort of ensured that I cultivate, because I'm not naturally interested in reading. So she told me very, when I was very young, she said, if you don't like it, cultivate it, because it is going to hold you in good stead. And I started with Enid Blyton's, and from there to John Grisham's, and that's also one of the reasons for my attraction to lawyers. So reading any day is something that completely takes care of my moods. And uh, when I consume any piece of knowledge, and I'm sure this is the case with a lot of people out there who like to read, I feel as if I have taken some pill, some amrit, and then suddenly I feel very happy, and I feel very refreshed. So reading, yes.
So, registered book, sorry, recently, which book are you reading and what
Well,
are you learning?
uh, I don't know, but here I would say that, like, I think Shah Rukh Khan, he's also a Scorpion. I don't read one book at a time. I read at least four books at a time, and I read all of them with a lot of enthusiasm. So one is Agatha Christie, for these kinds of transits where I don't want to use my brain, and I just want some a nice novel. So there is this the Blue Train mystery that I'm reading. And I usually read Agatha Christie because I really like the character Hercule Poirot, and his observation. My key takeaways are always observation. Then Yellowface is something that I recently read, and I was completely overwhelmed. I think Han Kang is the name of the author. Uh, and again, and the darkness of it all, and the deliciously woven language is something that really really amazed me. So these are the top two books that I'm reading at this moment.
Wow. So, let's go to your college days, campus law center. What are memories and experience from there?
So, Campus Law Center, I think the best memory that any CLCite would agree is when we used to sit under that tree in front of Dinkar tea stall. And we used to talk, and we used to chat, and of course the criminal law classes with Mr. BB Pandey. I'm sure all the CLCites who passed around that time, 2006, would very fondly remember Professor Pandey, because the way he used to describe, and the way he used to explain the Palani Godin case, it's still etched in my memory. And I still remember how people from other sections also used to come, and people would be sitting up till his ankle on the floor, and that's the popularity of that man. So I think I really really fondly remember those lectures. I remember the moot courts. I remember going to the courts for internships and seeing all those arguments. So yeah, very fondly remember those years at CLC, and I'm a very very proud CLCite.
So if your friends had to describe you in 3 words, what would they say?
Describe myself.
Yes, your friends describing you in 3 words, what would they say?
They would call me an energy ball, or they would call me somebody who's very passionate. So because that's something that I hear a lot from people, that
Beautiful.
I'm enthusiastic and energetic and passionate. I think these are the
Wow.
3 words.
So what is a family tradition you will never let it fade away?
Is to give. Is to give. Yes, because, and it's not the giving in that sense, because my father used to say, and I think it's a very Hindu thing, or it's a very Indian thing to say that when you are giving, when the left hand is giving, the right should not know.
Yes.
So I'm not talking about the giving the way these days it's so hot, and you make reels out of it, and you giving blankets, and you are using hashtags like hashtag joy of giving. No, it's not that giving I'm talking about. And my father used to always say that समाज के लिए काम करना चाहिए, योगी नहीं
Yes.
हो सकते तो उपयोगी तो जरूर होना चाहिए. So I think that is one thing that I would always remember, that utility doesn't mean that being used by somebody. These days people take it, mistake it for being used by people. No, if I know something that can help somebody, and that doesn't mean just being nice to people. He would always insist my taking up pro bono cases. He will always insist that I make contracts or lease agreements or whatever anybody in the family wanted. He would always push me to do that, and I still do that. And Thalassemia Patients Advocacy Group is one such tribute to my parents, because this is one place where uh, I do a lot of shram dan. I don't really give money, but I think it's my sweat and my blood, which I've got from the society, which I try to
Yes.
return. So that's the family tradition that I'm trying to uphold here.
Beautiful, beautiful. So I'm just trying to recollect one of Guruji, Prince Imad Khan, has shared about giving back, and the he, the divine has given you abundance of finance and intelligence, education. So you have to give back and enrich those persons who are in need, and you are doing in your ways and upayogi.
In
That's all.
fact, in fact, Amir, I don't even think that I have to give it to them. I have a theory, which is that I have been given these things so that these things can go to those people through me. They are
Yes.
actually they are the recipients. It's only that I am the medium, and I think that I'm very lucky if I have been chosen to give. So it's not mine. I'm just the medium. And I'm not saying it the way people typically say it, but I like to do it. And I truly, truly believe in that. It belongs to them and it's going to them.
Yes. That is what he had meant.
Yeah,
It was very deep impact when we have reflect. So that's what you are doing, and I'm
agree.
doing in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah, no, no.
Okay,
Wonderful work that you're doing.
yeah. So my last question is a googly one. Describe Anubha in one line.
I would also use the same
That is not from
word that,
friend viewpoint. Now from your viewpoint.
yeah, my viewpoint is also that upyogi. I consider myself to be very upyogi, and I think that's what I want to be known for. I don't want to be a waste, and I don't want to be a person who just came, lived, and left. Uh, I want to be known and see myself as a person. Uh, if you are around me, if I'm around you, uh, there will be a change after I've left. So
Beautiful. Yeah.
that's how I
So
look at myself.
Let's put in the next round, the rapid fire round. Your
Oh,
go-to comfort food.
Maggie,
Favorite
always
color. Favorite color.
white and black. Obvious reasons.
Strategy or instinct.
Instinct.
Delhi monsoon or Delhi winter.
Delhi monsoon. Delhi summers, actually. I know you're going to kill me for this, but Delhi summer.
Early mornings or late nights.
Late, 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 very late.
One law or policy figure you deeply admire, Indian or international.
Fali Nariman. Any day.
Uh, you have traveled internationally for advocacy. Which destination has left a personal imprint?
Greece.
Wow. Best piece of advice received.
Sorry, best?
Best piece of advice received.
Ek chup saw sukh.
Wow. One word that defines your leadership style.
Collaboration.
Your favorite Bengali cuisine.
Biryani.
Your favorite Punjabi cuisine.
Rajma chawal.
Tea or coffee to recharge.
Tea.
Let's discuss.
I should have said coffee. I know. But
Okay, thank you.
yeah, I'm a North Indian married to a Bengali, so it has to be tea.
Okay, so here's a gift which will autograph and send
Thank
to you.
you.
What
Thank
a journey from the vibrancy of campus debates to shaping national policy dialogues, from navigating complex governance structures to championing global health advocacy. Anubha reminds us that law isn't just a profession, it's a living, evolving instrument of social impact. Her story blends courage, clarity, resilience, and a commitment to health for all and hunger for none. As we close this conversation, we celebrate her extraordinary path and inspiration she continues to offer every emerging lawyer who dreams of leading with both intellect and integrity. So, like that, there are 800 plus coffee speakers have shared their professional, personal journeys. Subscribe, implement those in your life. See 2026 a better. And we continue the conversation with a cup of coffee with other speaker. So, take care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amir. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.